As the winter wind howled through the cracks of St. Luke's Hospice, Ivan Petrov, a frail 87-year-old, drew his final breaths. A lifetime of secrets weighed heavy on his soul. His nurse, a kind but inquisitive woman named Evelyn Moore, held his hand as he whispered, "I was a spy for the KGB." The room fell silent, his words slicing through the air like a knife. His confession would unravel decades of betrayal, love, and a mission that forever changed the world. The unforgiving winters of Moscow shaped not only its skyline but also the steel resolve of its people. Ivan Petrov, a brilliant and ambitious student at Lomonosov Moscow State University in the early 1950s, was among those molded by the cold. With raven black hair and sharp blue eyes, he was both admired and trusted, a trust that would one day become his greatest weapon. Born in the shadow of World War II, Ivan's childhood was one of air raid sirens and whispered farewells. His father, a factory worker, and his mother, a schoolteacher, instilled in him a fierce love for Mother Russia. "Our country is both sword and shield," his father often said during the Victory Day parades. Those words stayed with Ivan, becoming a mantra during the darkest moments of his life. By 20, Ivan's aptitude for languages set him apart. He could effortlessly switch between English, French, and German, dazzling his professors with his command of syntax and accents. Yet it wasn't just his academic brilliance that drew attention. It was his ability to read people. Ivan had an innate sense of when someone was lying or hiding something, a skill that would later become invaluable. One evening, as Ivan studied late in the university library, a man approached him. Dressed in a nondescript gray suit, the stranger exuded an air of authority. "You have a gift," he said, sliding a card across the table. "And Mother Russia has need of it." At first, Ivan dismissed it as a joke, but curiosity got the better of him, and the next day he called the number on the card. What followed was a whirlwind. Ivan was taken to a facility on the outskirts of Moscow, its unmarked walls radiating secrecy. There he met Colonel Viktor Alexeyev, a man whose mere presence commanded respect. "You've been chosen because you're exceptional," Alexeyev declared. "Your mind is a weapon, and we will teach you to wield it." Over the next 2 years, Ivan's life transformed. His training was relentless. He learned to crack codes, shadow targets, and extract information from even the most guarded individuals. His instructors drilled him on psychological manipulation, teaching him how to exploit vulnerabilities. "A spy's greatest weapon," Alexeyev often said, "is trust. Gain it, and you control everything." Yet the training wasn't purely technical. Ivan was taught to blend seamlessly into any environment, adopting new identities as easily as changing clothes. In one exercise, he posed as a British tourist, charming his way through checkpoints and gathering intelligence on mock foreign officials. In another, he infiltrated a simulated NATO meeting, his performance so convincing that even his instructors were momentarily fooled. Despite his growing skill set, Ivan couldn't completely detach from his old life. He thought often of his parents, especially his mother's letters. Her last one, filled with mundane details about her garden, lay unopened on his desk. He told himself this distance was for their safety, yet the guilt lingered, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. In 1953, Ivan received his first mission. The Cold War was at its peak, and tensions between East and West were escalating. His assignment was to infiltrate the American embassy in Paris, posing as an interpreter for the Soviet delegation. On paper, it seemed straightforward: observe, listen, and report. In reality, it was far more dangerous. The embassy buzzed with activity, a microcosm of the larger geopolitical chess game. Diplomats, military officials, and spies moved through its halls, each playing their part. Ivan quickly distinguished himself, not just with his linguistic prowess, but with his charm. He had a knack for putting people at ease, a talent that allowed him to extract information without raising suspicion. Every evening, Ivan returned to his modest Parisian apartment to encrypt his findings and send them back to Moscow. His reports detailed everything from the embassy's security protocols to the personal lives of key personnel. The KGB praised his work, but success came at a cost. Ivan began to feel the weight of his double life, the constant need to lie, deceive, and manipulate. One evening, as he sipped coffee at a cafe near the embassy, Ivan noticed a man watching him. The stranger's scarred face and unflinching gaze set off alarm bells. For weeks, Ivan had operated without suspicion, but now it seemed someone was on to him. He managed to lose the man in the labyrinthine streets of Paris, but the encounter left him shaken. He couldn't afford mistakes. Not when the stakes were this high. By the end of his first year, Ivan's intelligence had exposed several American operatives and thwarted a clandestine operation in Europe. His superiors in Moscow lauded his achievements, but they also began to view him with caution. In the world of espionage, even the most successful agents were expendable. Spies who knew too much rarely lived long enough to enjoy their accolades. Still, Ivan pressed on, driven by a sense of duty that was both a source of strength and a burden. He told himself it was for the greater good, for the ideals of his homeland. But as the line between duty and identity blurred, the personas he adopted began to feel more real than the man he once was, setting the stage for a life forever shrouded in shadows. Paris in the 1950s was a city of contrasts, a haven of art and love, yet also a theater of Cold War intrigue. Ivan Petrov, now deeply entrenched in his role as a KGB operative, found himself both captivated and conflicted by the city's charm. While he moved through embassy halls and Parisian streets with practiced ease, his carefully constructed facade was about to be tested in a way he never anticipated. It began on an overcast afternoon in late spring. Ivan was seated at a cafe near the Seine, his usual spot for observing the comings and goings of embassy staff and suspected Western operatives. A book lay open on his table, a convenient prop that concealed a small notepad. He barely noticed the woman who sat beside him until she spoke. "Excuse me," she said in lightly accented French. "Do you have a pen I could borrow?" Ivan looked up, startled. The woman was striking. Wavy auburn hair framed her delicate features, and her hazel eyes held a spark of curiosity. He handed her his pen without a word, his caution temporarily overridden by an inexplicable urge to engage. "Merci," she said, offering a small smile before turning back to her notebook. Ivan forced himself to return to his surveillance, but his focus was broken. Finally, she closed her notebook and stood, returning his pen with a polite nod. "Merci encore," she said before walking away. Ivan realized he hadn't spoken a single word. Over the next week, their paths crossed twice more, once at the same cafe and again at a bookshop. On the fourth meeting, it was the woman who approached him. "You seem to enjoy people watching," she said in perfect English. "Do you always sit alone?" Ivan hesitated. "Sometimes. It's a good way to learn about people." "And what have you learned about me?" she asked, teasing. Ivan smiled faintly. "That you're curious. Perhaps too curious." She laughed, a soft sound that melted the tension in the air. "Margaret Blake," she said, extending a hand. "But my friends call me Maggie." "Ivan," he replied, shaking her hand. He gave no surname. Maggie didn't press, and for that, Ivan was grateful. Their conversations became a regular occurrence. Maggie was a journalist, though she never mentioned which publication she worked for. Ivan found himself drawn to her sharp wit and unapologetic curiosity, even as his instincts warned him to keep his guard up. Maggie, in turn, seemed intrigued by Ivan's quiet demeanor and enigmatic aura. For weeks they met at cafes and parks, their conversations ranging from literature to politics. Maggie challenged Ivan's worldview, forcing him to reconsider the propaganda he'd been raised on. "Do you really believe the West is the enemy?" she asked one evening. Ivan hesitated. I believe nations have interests. Sometimes those interests clash. And individuals? Do you think they're pawns in a larger game? I think individuals make choices, Ivan said, his voice steady. But those choices are rarely free from consequence. Maggie studied him for a moment before nodding. Fair enough. Despite his best efforts, Ivan found himself lowering his defenses. He told himself it was part of his cover, a necessary step to maintain his role as an unassuming interpreter. But the truth was more complicated. For the first time in years, Ivan felt a connection not tied to duty or deception. It was exhilarating and dangerous. The danger became apparent when Ivan returned to his apartment to find a note slipped under his door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. Your friend asks too many questions. Be careful. Ivan's blood ran cold. He scanned the hallway before retreating inside, his mind racing. Who had left the note? A fellow KGB operative? A Western spy? The implications were equally troubling. Maggie had become a liability, whether she intended to or not. The next time they met, Ivan was more guarded. Maggie noticed. You're quiet today, she remarked. Just tired, Ivan lied. She didn't press, but her gaze lingered. Ivan felt a pang of guilt, but he reminded himself of the stakes. His mission came first. It always had to come first. Yet Ivan couldn't bring himself to cut ties with Maggie. Their conversations continued, though he was more careful now, steering the dialogue away from anything too personal. But the bond between them only grew stronger. One evening, as they walked through the city, Maggie stopped. Ivan, I need to ask you something, she said, her tone serious. Who are you, really? Ivan froze, his mind racing for a plausible answer. Just a man trying to make sense of the world, he said finally. Maggie frowned, but didn't push further. I hope that's true, she said quietly, because I'd hate to think I've been wrong about you. As Ivan watched her walk away that night, he felt the weight of her words. For the first time, he questioned not just his mission, but the choices that had led him to this moment. He was a spy, trained to manipulate and deceive. Yet with Maggie, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one being unraveled. The line between duty and desire had begun to blur, and Ivan knew it was only a matter of time before it snapped entirely. By the summer of 1954, Ivan Petrov was a rising star in the KGB. His intelligence had disrupted covert Western operations across Europe, but with success came greater risks. His next mission would push him to the brink, testing his loyalty, his skills, and his humanity. The assignment began with a summons to the Soviet embassy in Paris. Ivan was briefed by Major Sergei Orlov, a no-nonsense KGB officer. A high-ranking NATO official has been leaking classified intelligence, Orlov said. Your task is to retrieve it and identify the traitor. This is a priority mission. Ivan's target was Colonel Richard Carlisle, an American liaison officer working at NATO headquarters in Brussels. Carlisle was known for his meticulous nature and sharp instincts, making him a formidable opponent. Ivan's orders were to infiltrate Carlisle's circle, monitor his activities, and recover the stolen information at all costs. Under the guise of a Soviet cultural attaché, Ivan arrived in Brussels and began attending diplomatic events. He used these gatherings to gather intelligence, mingling with Western diplomats while maintaining his cover. It wasn't long before he identified Carlisle at a reception. The colonel's piercing gaze and guarded demeanor immediately set him apart. Over the next several days, Ivan studied Carlisle's routine. One detail stood out. Carlisle frequently visited a small cafe near NATO headquarters, where he spoke briefly with a young woman. Ivan's instincts told him these meetings were more than casual. Acting on a hunch, Ivan followed the woman one evening. She led him to an apartment building, where a mailbox confirmed her name. Sophie Dufresne. Further surveillance revealed Sophie worked as a typist at NATO, giving her access to sensitive information. Moscow's confirmation came swiftly. Sophie was the intermediary between Carlisle and the Americans. Orders followed. Intercept the intelligence. Use any means necessary. The opportunity came a week later. Sophie left the NATO office late one evening, carrying a briefcase. Evan followed her through the quiet streets, keeping a safe distance. The tension was palpable, every step heightening his anticipation. When they reached a secluded area, Ivan stepped out of the shadows. "Sophie," he said calmly. She froze, her eyes wide with shock. "You don't know me, but I know who you are." Sophie's grip tightened on the briefcase. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice trembling. "You're passing information to the Americans," Ivan said, taking a step closer. "That briefcase contains classified documents." Sophie's resolve faltered, her hands shaking. "Who are you?" she demanded. "A friend," Ivan replied. "One who can help you if you cooperate. But if you don't—" He let the threat linger, his expression unreadable. After a tense pause, Sophie handed over the briefcase. Inside were sensitive NATO documents confirming Ivan's suspicions. "You've made the right choice," he said softly, his tone unexpectedly gentle. "Go home and forget this ever happened." Ivan watched her retreat into the night, her figure dissolving into the shadows. Returning to his apartment, he spent hours encrypting the documents and preparing them for transmission to Moscow. The mission was a success, yet it left a bitter taste. Sophie's fear haunted him, a stark reminder of the human cost of his work. The next day, Ivan received a message from Moscow. "Well done. Return to Paris immediately." But as he boarded the train, the weight of the mission bore down on him. The mission had been a triumph, but it felt hollow, a victory tainted by guilt and doubt. Sophie's trembling hands, her frightened eyes, they lingered in his mind, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. For the first time, Ivan began to question the path he had chosen. He had always believed in the cause, trusting in its righteousness. But now, the line between duty and morality had begun to blur, and the cost of his allegiance seemed heavier than ever. As the train sped through the countryside, Ivan stared out the window, his reflection ghostly in the darkened glass. The rhythmic hum of the train felt oppressive, amplifying the questions that echoed in his mind. He thought of Maggie back in Paris, her probing questions about right and wrong. What would she say if she knew the truth about him? The countryside blurred past, a tapestry of fields and villages. Ivan wondered how many more missions it would take before he lost himself completely. The train's whistle cut through the night, sharp and hollow like a warning he couldn't ignore. Ivan closed his eyes, but the shadows in his mind refused to fade. As the train approached Paris, Ivan steeled himself for what awaited him. The streets of the city would soon welcome him back, but Ivan knew that each return to the life of espionage took more from him than he could ever regain. For now, he would press on, but a question gnawed at the edges of his resolve. How much longer could he live this way, caught between shadows and duty? The air in Paris had grown heavy with suspicion. Ivan Petrov, back from Brussels, felt the weight of unseen eyes on him. His success with the NATO mission had elevated his status within the KGB, but it had also made him a target. In the world of espionage, trust was fleeting, and even allies could become enemies. It began with a subtle shift. The usual cryptic messages from Moscow grew colder, their tone more demanding. Ivan noticed a car that seemed to follow him through the winding Parisian streets. And then there was the stranger, a man who appeared at the same cafes Ivan frequented. At first, Ivan dismissed it as paranoia, but the signs became impossible to ignore. His suspicions were confirmed one evening when he intercepted a message meant for one of his handlers. The contents were chilling. "Monitor Petrov. Possible compromise." Ivan's blood ran cold. The very organization he had dedicated his life to was now turning its gaze inward, questioning his loyalty. Ivan knew what came next. The KGB was relentless with operatives it suspected of betrayal. They would watch, wait, and, if necessary, eliminate. Ivan's options were limited: prove his loyalty or disappear. But how could he prove loyalty when even his most recent successes were tainted by suspicion? Maggie had become an unwitting complication. Their relationship, once a carefully controlled cover, had grown into something far more personal. Ivan had tried to keep her at a distance, but she had a way of breaking through his defenses. Her questions, her unwavering belief in truth, they had begun to erode the walls Ivan had spent years building. Now, she was his greatest vulnerability. One evening, as they walked along the Seine, Maggie stopped abruptly. "Ivan, something's wrong. I can feel it. You've been different lately." "I'm fine," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. She studied him, her hazel eyes searching his. "You're lying. You don't have to face it alone. Let me help." Ivan felt a pang of guilt. He wanted to tell her everything, to unburden himself of the secrets that had consumed him. But he couldn't. To involve Maggie would be to put her life in danger. Instead, he said, "You can't help me, Maggie. No one can." The conversation left an ache in his chest, but there was no time to dwell on it. Ivan knew he had to act. The KGB wouldn't wait forever, and every day he remained in Paris increased the likelihood of his exposure. He began to prepare for an escape, a plan he hoped he would never have to use. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. One evening, Ivan returned to his apartment to find the door slightly ajar. Inside, the room had been searched. Drawers were open, papers scattered. Someone had been looking for something they believed Ivan had. A shadow moved in the corner of his vision. Ivan reacted instinctively, reaching for the pistol he kept hidden beneath his jacket. The intruder lunged at him, a flash of steel glinting in the dim light. Ivan deflected the knife with his forearm, the blade slicing through fabric. Ignoring the pain, he retaliated, striking the intruder with the butt of his pistol. The man crumpled to the floor. Breathing heavily, Ivan examined the unconscious figure. He recognized him, a low-level KGB operative. The realization sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. The KGB wasn't just watching anymore. They were acting. Ivan knew he had to leave immediately. He grabbed the essentials: forged passports, cash, and a small encrypted device containing the intelligence he had gathered over the years. As he slipped into the Parisian night, he felt the weight of his double life pressing down on him. He was no longer just a spy. He was a fugitive. The following days were a blur of movement and deception. Ivan used every trick he had learned to stay ahead of his pursuers. He switched trains, changed disguises, and avoided familiar routes. Each moment was a test of his training, a battle against the relentless machine that had once been his ally. But escape was only half the battle. Ivan needed a destination, a place where the KGB couldn't reach him. He thought of Maggie and the life she had described, a life unburdened by secrets. For a fleeting moment, he considered reaching out to her, but he dismissed the thought. Maggie was safer without him. Eventually, Ivan made his way to the southern coast of France, where he secured passage on a cargo ship bound for Istanbul. The ship was old and rusted, its crew a mix of mercenaries and misfits. Ivan paid them well and asked no questions. As the vessel drifted into open waters, Ivan allowed himself a moment of reflection. The life he had known was gone. The KGB would label him a traitor, a rogue operative who had turned his back on his country. But Ivan didn't feel like a traitor. He felt like a man searching for something: freedom, redemption, perhaps even peace. The cargo ship's engine rumbled beneath him, a constant reminder of the distance growing between him and the life he had left behind. For the first time in years, Ivan felt a glimmer of hope. It was fragile, fleeting, but it was enough to keep him moving forward. The journey to Istanbul had been uneventful, but Ivan Petrov knew the quiet wouldn't last. The KGB wouldn't stop pursuing him. As the cargo ship docked under a blanket of night, Ivan stepped into Istanbul, a city pulsing with secrets and shadows, a melting pot of cultures and an intersection of countless clandestine operations. Blending into the crowd came naturally to Ivan. The bustling port was filled with merchants and travelers, all too absorbed in their own lives to notice a lone man with a small bag. Istanbul's chaotic energy seemed like a shield, yet Ivan remained cautious. By dawn, he had secured a small apartment in Beyoğlu. The landlord, a gruff man who asked few questions, took cash and offered a key. Ivan wasted no time setting up the space as a temporary hideout. He knew the city's labyrinthine alleys could hide as much as they revealed. For several days, Ivan lived in careful anonymity, changing his routes, avoiding routines, and scanning every street for signs of surveillance. Istanbul was alive with activity at all hours, its narrow streets crowded with vendors, darting children, and stray cats weaving through it all. But even amidst the chaos, Ivan's trained eyes spotted patterns. On the fifth day, he noticed a man in a gray jacket lingering near a cafe Ivan frequented. The man appeared ordinary, his jacket faded, his briefcase scuffed, but his presence was deliberate, his movements too calculated. Ivan's instincts sharpened. This wasn't coincidence. That evening, Ivan left his apartment with only the essentials. He slipped into the crowded streets, walking with purpose yet without haste. The city seemed to close in around him, the narrow pathways amplifying every footstep. Pausing near a vendor selling roasted chestnuts, Ivan glanced back. The man in the gray jacket was there, pretending to examine a map. Ivan's training took over. He continued walking, this time toward the waterfront. He needed confirmation. Reaching a bridge, he stopped, leaning on the railing as if admiring the view. Minutes passed. When he turned, the man was there, his briefcase clutched tightly. Their eyes met, and in that instant Ivan knew. He was being hunted. The chase began. Ivan darted through crowded streets, his pursuer close behind. He turned sharp corners, vaulted over crates, and slipped through narrow alleys. The city's chaos worked to his advantage, but he knew he couldn't keep running. Spotting a derelict building, Ivan ducked inside, pressing himself against the wall. The footsteps outside grew louder, then faded. For now, he was safe. Safety, however, was an illusion. Ivan knew the KGB wouldn't send just one operative. The man in the gray jacket was likely part of a larger team. They would be closing in, tightening the net. Ivan needed a plan. The next day, Ivan reached out to Dmitri, a former KGB operative who had gone rogue and now dealt in forged documents. Dmitri had built a reputation in Istanbul's underworld, his services sought by deserters, smugglers, and fugitives. Their meeting was tense. Dmitri, older and grayer, had lost none of his sharpness. "You've made quite the mess, Ivan," Dmitri said, his voice low. "The KGB doesn't take betrayal lightly." "I didn't betray anyone," Ivan shot back. "They betrayed me." Dmitri smirked. "Tell yourself whatever helps you sleep at night. What do you need?" "Passage out of Istanbul," Ivan said, "and a new identity." Dmitri leaned back, considering. "That won't be cheap." Ivan placed a stack of cash on the table. "Will this cover it?" Dmitri nodded, pocketing the money. "There's a freighter leaving for Alexandria in 2 days. I can get you on it. But be careful, Ivan. Istanbul isn't the only place with eyes." The deal was set, but the hours leading up to Ivan's departure were fraught with tension. He moved cautiously, avoiding his usual routes and staying out of sight. Returning to his apartment that evening, he found a note slipped under the door. It was unsigned, but its message was clear. "You can run, but you can't hide." The words sent a chill down Ivan's spine. Someone had found him. But why leave a warning instead of acting? Was it a trap? A psychological game? Ivan couldn't be sure, but he knew one thing. His time in Istanbul was running out. The journey to the freighter was nerve-wracking. Dmitri had arranged a car, but every turn of the wheel felt like an eternity. At the port, Dmitri handed Ivan a forged passport. "Good luck," he said. "You'll need it." The freighter was a hulking mass of rust and steel, its crew a mix of hardened men who spoke little. Ivan boarded without incident, but as the ship pulled away, he couldn't shake the feeling he was being watched. He stayed on edge, scanning the deck for familiar faces, listening for out-of-place sounds. But the hours passed without trouble. As the freighter drifted into open waters, Ivan allowed himself a moment of reprieve. The KGB's net had failed to ensnare him, for now. But Ivan knew this was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, was a life free from shadows. He just had to survive long enough to reach it. As the freighter approached Alexandria, Ivan Petrov felt the familiar weight of unease settle over him. The open waters had offered a fleeting sense of safety, but the sprawling port city ahead held no guarantees. Its labyrinthine streets could be his salvation or his undoing. Ivan knew the KGB wouldn't stop hunting him, and Alexandria was merely the next battleground. The dock was alive with chaos as the freighter came to rest. Merchants shouted over one another, their stalls overflowing with spices and textiles, while laborers hauled crates from the ships. Ivan disembarked with practiced ease, his small bag slung over his shoulder. He moved quickly but deliberately, merging into the crowd. Every step was calculated, every glance over his shoulder purposeful. He needed to disappear. By nightfall, Ivan had secured a room in a modest boarding house tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. The room was sparse, a narrow bed, a creaking chair, and a single window overlooking a dim alley. It was enough. Ivan set his bag on the table and unpacked his essentials: a forged passport, a handful of cash, and the encrypted device. He stared at the device for a moment, its polished surface gleaming under the weak light. It was both his greatest asset and his heaviest burden. For 3 days, Ivan maintained a low profile. He wandered the city cautiously, taking different routes each time, blending into the crowds. Alexandria was a city of whispers, its bazaars teeming with intrigue. Ivan listened carefully, piecing together fragments of conversations. On the 3rd day, his paranoia was confirmed. At a cafe 2 streets from the boarding house, Ivan spotted a man in a black coat seated by the window. The man's gaze lingered on Ivan a second too long before he turned back to his coffee. The next day, Ivan saw him again, this time near the market. The man wasn't alone. Another figure, a woman in a plain dress, hovered nearby. Their movements were subtle, but to Ivan, they were unmistakable. The KGB was closing in. That night, Ivan packed his belongings and slipped out of the boarding house under the cover of darkness. The city's winding alleys became his refuge as he moved swiftly and silently. He knew the KGB's tactics. They would try to box him in, to force him into a trap. But Ivan had been trained for this. He turned sharp corners, ducked under awnings, and doubled back through crowded streets. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. As Ivan rounded a corner, a voice called out, "Going somewhere, Ivan?" A figure stepped into the dim light of a street lamp, his hands raised in mock surrender. The man's face was shadowed, but his voice carried a sly confidence. "You've made this more interesting than I expected." Ivan's hand moved instinctively to the knife concealed beneath his coat. "Who are you?" he demanded. "A friend," the man said with a smirk, "or an opportunity. It depends on how you see it." "What do you want?" Ivan asked, his voice sharp. "You're carrying something valuable," the man replied. "I can help you, for a price." Ivan's grip tightened on the knife. "Why should I trust you?" The man chuckled. "Trust me or don't. But the KGB isn't the only one hunting you. Think about it." Before Ivan could respond, the man disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the faint echo of his footsteps. Ivan stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. The encounter unsettled him. The KGB was relentless, but now there were others, unknown players in a game he barely understood. The following morning, Ivan made a decision. He couldn't do this alone. He reached out to Nadia, a former MI6 operative turned freelancer. Their history was fraught with tension, but Nadia was resourceful and, most importantly, discreet. If anyone could help him navigate this minefield, it was her. They met in a dimly lit tea house on the city's outskirts. Nadia was already seated when Ivan arrived, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She looked up as he approached, her expression cool. "Ivan," she said, "I thought you were dead." "Not yet," Ivan replied, taking the seat across from her, "but I might be soon." Nadia smirked. "You always were dramatic. What do you want?" "Freedom," Ivan said simply. "And I have something to trade." He placed the encrypted device on the table. Nadia's eyes flicked to it, her expression sharpening. "Is that what I think it is?" "Years of intelligence," Ivan said. "Enough to make me a target, enough to buy my way out." Nadia leaned back, considering. "The KGB won't forgive this, and if it's not them, someone else will come after you." "I know," Ivan said, "but I'm running out of options." After a long pause, Nadia nodded. "All right, I'll help you, but if you're lying about what's on this, don't expect me to save you." The deal was struck, but Ivan knew it wouldn't be simple. Nadia was capable, but the KGB's reach was vast, and the encrypted device was a beacon for trouble. As he left the tea house, Ivan felt the weight of his decision. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but for the first time in years, he had a plan. Beyond the shadows lay the faint glimmer of freedom. Ivan just had to survive long enough to reach it.